Hello everyone and welcome to a limited edition of the Next Gen podcast. We're here today to bring you a review of F1 22. I'm delighted to say that we've got the podcast back after quite a period of time out. And of course, I'm Jack Millington, who's going to be talking you through a couple of the ins and outs of the Formula 1 22 game that's just been released in the past month. But joining me tonight to go on this whirlwind of discussion is Jordan. Good to have you back, friend.
Yeah, good evening. It's you say been a long time coming, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has, absolutely. And you know, the podcast was quite a good part of what had been going on in Next Gen before, but obviously time commitments and stuff meant we couldn't get ourselves back. But we're back for a limited edition run, which I'm hoping you will all enjoy. And before we get into it, you can see on the screen I've got some gameplay running in the background. I'll go through and cycle a few options as well after that, but let's see how this game goes. I mean, what I want to say before we start is, this is quite a big release in terms of a year for racing games. There's quite a lot of announcements that have been going out. Of course, Gran Turismo 7 is out in the wild at the moment. We know Forza Motorsport is coming within the next 12 months. So some quite big heavyweight releases, and we know that Codemasters as well are going to be releasing the next WRC game coming in 2023. So that's going to be fascinating too. But today we're focusing on F1. And we've got a lot to talk about, got a lot to cover. So Jordan, reckon we should get started?
I think so.
I think so too, buddy. I think so too. So, for those that are out of the loop a little bit about F1, just so you're aware, 22, it's the 14th game under the stewardship of Codemasters. For those that are aware, it started way back in F1 2009 on the Wii, which a lot of people don't talk about, but really the big cement in place for Codemasters were 2010. And since then, every consecutive year, F1 has been developed by the company. Now, this is the first game, really, that has been under the direct influence of EA, so to speak. Obviously, EA bought out Codemasters back in 2020. They started that in 2020 and finalised the process in 21, and now you can start to see a couple of the effects within the game. You can see a little bit more in terms of the EA branding, a little bit more in that, and we'll come on to that later on. But let's start with the gameplay in terms of F1. Let's talk about the positives, the negatives of the game in terms of how the cars handle, because of course this is a brand new generation of Formula 1 cars. It's new for everybody. It gives everyone a chance to see what the drivers are fighting in real life. Obviously the season started back in March. We're now in August, halfway point of the season. So how are the cars getting on? How are the cars being updated through the game? There's been a lot to do with that. Jordan, from your perspective, because obviously you've owned the game a couple of days earlier than me. You bought the Champions Edition, I bought the Standard Edition, and you had F1 21. You've had most of the consecutive Codemasters games that have been out in the last few years. What are the noticeable changes for you compared from the 21 car to the 22 car when you drive it within the game? What's your thoughts?
I mean, the 21 car you could definitely push harder in terms of the aerodynamic. You can feel the lack of effectively the top aerodynamics that are there, because with the new regulations you've got less winglets, basically less of everything on top. It's a much simpler car. So in terms of that, you can definitely feel the lack of downforce from the top of the car. And I think you also agree, Jack, because if you run the simulation damage, you actually feel a lot more of the floor damage than you ever used to. You used to have to damage the floor a fair bit to take a decent effect on the car. Now it's one tap and the car feels like it's a Mark II Escort.
Getting his rally references in straight away is Jord. But I agree, Jord. I think that there are quite a lot of challenges with this new game. Obviously, there's increased speeds due to the ground effect of the cars. That's something that's really factored in. There's certain tracks where I feel like the effects are really pronounced, such as Spa, for example. The cars fly around that track like nothing I've ever believed. But the game itself has done and we'll talk about the pros and cons and positives and negatives, of course, throughout this podcast. But the game has done, I think, an excellent job of simulating and showing the new rule set for F1 this season. I think they've done a really good job. The cars feel very different to drive compared to the 21 machinery. There's a lot more nuance needed in terms of throttle application. The car has a lot of torque usage that I've not felt before from former F1 games. I've played all the F1 games consecutively pretty much, apart from 2014 being the odd year out. So this feels like a really nice nuanced handling model, I should say, for the first time since potentially F1 2020. And I'm really enjoying how the cars feel, how they react to bumps, how they react to sort of different areas of the track, elevation changes. The cars feel a lot more alive yet lazy. It's a very interesting dynamic, I think. In terms of the outside of the actual car, in terms of gameplay, Jordan, how do you think, because obviously you've played 21, I've played 2021 as well, do you think that the changes to the track side in terms of the curbs, the sausage curbs, the gravel traps and everything, do you think that that's improved from the 2021 game? Because that's what I'm going to try and compare it to, I think, today, and we're going to try and compare that and compare F1 21-22 standing rather in the whole market. But do you think it's improved? Do you think the game's moved forward since last year?
I mean, in terms of the actual tracks itself, in terms of the curves, and I don't think they're much different. However, what is different is the physics of the way the car reacts on them. Because you can attack the curbs a lot more in the 22 game than you ever could in 21. I mean, the amount of times you clip a curb in the 21 game, it could be a flat curb, it could be a ridged curb, and all of a sudden the back end's out, whereas on this game you can definitely attack them, or you can't obviously go full pelt at them, because that will spin the car out, but you can definitely attack the curbs more than I think you ever really could do in an F1 game. But again, that is probably partially down to the new regulations and the fact that, again, the aero doesn't get unbalanced, should we say, when it starts going over the bumps and the curbs. But what is interesting, I think, is there are times where you do feel like in a practice session, in a qualifying session, where the track, you can feel the rubbering in a lot more than I think you could in 21. You feel at the end of a session, you can feel that the car just grips that little bit more than it did like 10 minutes ago in the session.
Yeah, I think there's been quite a lot of little quality of life updates that have come from 21 to 22. I feel, for me, that quite a lot of improvements have come, as you say, you know, the track surface feeling a little bit different depending on where you are in the session. That feels really strong. I think some of the other little additions in terms of gameplay, being able to take control in terms of being fully under a safety car, that's been such a requested feature that hasn't been in an F1 game for such a long time. You can now do that. You've got a little bit more control over the pit stops and warming up your tyres as you come out of the pit. So you make a pit stop and the tyres are going to be cold, you've got to try and warm them up quite quickly. That's a really good feature. I think that's something that has clearly been added into F1 22 with a lot of care and a lot of nuance, and it pays off. I think it's a really strong set of additions that just make the game that little bit more enjoyable, that little bit more immersive. You know, of course, as well, factoring in the other little additions such as the broadcast mode. Now, if you look in terms of if you want to go a bit further with the gameplay, you know, you can have the immersive or the broadcast versions of safety cars, so you don't have to take control, you can just watch if you wish to. Or you can do that with the pit stops as well. You can have that same feature, which I think is quite nice for regulars, people who perhaps aren't, maybe they just don't want to take control of their car, they want the AI to do it for them, and the AI does a good job of sorting that for them. Now, obviously, when we talk about gameplay, we can't ignore the AI itself. I feel this year that the AI is more aggressive than it's ever been. You can see I've been playing the last 7 laps of my sprint race that I was doing earlier, and you can see the AI, the way they're attacking into corners, the way they're defending really hard. I think that this year's game is the most aggressive the AI have been. I still think there's a few issues on lap 1, and I still think the AI are a little bit confused by slower cars, but when it's wheel-to-wheel combat, they really will take no prisoners, and if they want to fire you off the track, they will fire you off the track. Jordan, your experience with the AI, has it been any different from mine? What do you think?
Well, I'll tell you about the AI in a minute, because I was just going to add on to your immersive and broadcast point, like safety cars. And the biggest one of that, I think, is actually the formation rules. Because you can now actually control going into your grid slot.
Yep.
Which means you can start at an angle, just like real life now.
Yeah.
And I've done it a couple of times, especially the AI where I've made the car angle either in or out just to get that slightly better start. And you do actually sometimes gain that advantage. So I think that's quite a good feature. But in terms of the AI, exactly the same. I would suggest that the AI they're more aggressive. They do stick it, like the amount of times on 21 where I would stick it down the inside, force them on the outside, and they just almost give it up. They do that a lot less now. You pretty much have to run them out the road before they give up on an overtake or trying to defend their position. I mean, it's a nice thing really, because it makes the racing, especially in career mode, that bit more competitive, and it makes it more rewarding when you do get points on the lower end car. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's, one point you've made really, really well there, Jordan, in terms of the AI are a lot less willing to give up places. Now, that can be a good thing and a bad thing. It's great if you're doing a career mode and the AI are really aggressive and they stop you from getting up the order so easily. On the other hand, some people are finding it, from what I've heard, a little bit difficult to adapt to because they've been fired off the road by the AI rather stupidly, which, I haven't really come across that. I'm only saying what I've heard from other people when I say those comments. But I do like the more aggressive AI. I think that's a good thing to have in an F1 game. For too many years in a row, the AI were very easy to overtake. The lap 1 issues that we used to have are pretty much gone. They're still a little bit tentative, but you would think that would be the case anyway, because in real life the drivers are a little bit more tentative on the opening lap, especially into turn 1 and getting the tyres up to temperature. So that's something that I think is a really good positive, to build on the positives that we've talked about so far. One other thing I want to mention about in terms of a really good feature is the ability now to get stuck in gravel traps. I know that's might not be a big thing on someone's radar, but for me, I feel like that's a feature that's kind of missing in most games, most racing games really. I can't think of many off the top of my head that have that, getting stuck in a gravel trap feature. I mean, Jordan, have you been stuck in a gravel trap at any time recently?
No, I've managed to keep my car on the tarmac mostly, to be honest.
Yeah, unlike me, which has been an issue. But I think it does punish drivers a little bit more, and I think that's important for this game. I think again to highlight the difficulty between those that play quite casually and those that do play in terms of like we are with NXTGEN, in terms of a sim racing league. It's really important that we have as much simulation as possible. Now, I'm not going to get into a debate about whether F1 or the F1 series is a sim or an arcade game, because we will waste a lot of time looking at that. But what I do feel like is that F1 is leaning more towards a simulation aspect of the cars, the way they handle, the way they feel, and I think this is probably the best handling model that I've come across in a Codemasters F1 game for quite a few years. So I'd argue it's probably the best since F1 2020. I felt like last year's game took a step backwards. Jordan, what are your thoughts on it? Do you think that this is, in terms of gameplay and everything so far, where does it rank for you? Do you think it's good, bad? What do you reckon?
I mean, the gameplay of it itself is, again, I mean, I've always regarded probably one of the best F1s to be in the very early editions, which is 2010. That was a very, very good game.
Yeah.
That still ranks one of the highest ones on the list.
Absolutely.
And in terms of the actual racing, the AI, and even obviously the My Team setup, even though it's the same, it's still constant development. That side is very good. In terms of the handling, I think it's hard to really judge exactly how good the handling is, because obviously it's a brand new reg, which means it's a brand new physics model. I mean, would we have seen much of a change if the regs didn't change compared to the last couple of games? I think 21 was better than 20, in my opinion, because the cars were slightly more bolted, which was correct in terms of the regulations.
I know we differ in opinion on that.
Yeah. In my opinion, they were a bit more bolted in 2021, which made more sense.
Yeah.
For the regulations. Whereas now, because of the whole different set and the fact the cars are that little bit looser, they are obviously on the 18-inch rims, which make it even further different. I think it's hard to really compare the handling between the games, other than what was almost like what you think the car should be doing compared to what they put in the physics to a degree.
Yeah, I completely understand that. I think you've made some good points there, Jordan. To be honest, I think looking at that, and you are right when you say, would the physics been much different had the regs been changed? Probably not. To be honest, I think they probably would have concentrated elsewhere. But it necessitated a change, and that's exactly what they've done. And I feel like, for me personally, I feel like it's a leap forward. I think it feels nice, but it is a little bit incomparable when you look at the previous game. So it's up in the air a little bit. I think there's a lot of points to be made about that. Now, of course, we can't talk just about gameplay in terms of Formula 1. There are other cars featured in the game. Of course, you've got Formula 2, which I'll just let everybody know now feels pretty similar to the game, the cars, the F221 cars in F1 2021. They feel pretty similar. I won't lie, obviously F2 isn't the focus for this season's game. They obviously want to get the gameplay regs right for the main series, Formula 1 series, that is. So F2 feels quite similar. There's no real change, I don't think, between 21 and 22. However, the new addition that's come along is F1 Life, which has been quite controversial. And to give a bit of background for those that don't know, or don't know the game, or even those that do own the game, when F1 Life was first revealed, there was quite a lot of negative feedback surrounding the launch of it, because a lot of people, the general paying public, didn't see the point of featuring road cars within the game. They didn't want that. They didn't see the point of it. But Codemasters and EA Sports pressed on, and it now features within F1 22. Now, me and Jordan have both given a lot of praise so far to the game, and absolutely it deserves it. But F1 Life is where it starts to pull everything down, in my thoughts, because F1 Life is what's the word I'm looking for? For me, a pointless add-on. I don't see the point of F1 Life. I get that there are elements of it that are quite good, like the idea of Pirelli hot lapping, which does actually happen in the series. I get that makes sense. However, the cars themselves feel, well, there's only one word to say it: slow. Now, the problem is that they feel slow because it's a road car, pretty much, compared to an F1 car. So of course they're going to feel slow, but they feel, it's on a wheel. For me, they feel a little bit, I'd say, weak. It's almost sort of a dull sensation when I drive them. Jord, I know you've done a bit more driving in them than what I've done. how do you feel in terms of how the cars are, and your thoughts on F1 life in general?
The cars, well, let's face it, the physics just aren't right for the supercars.
No, I agree.
That's about plain and simple. I mean, Project Cars 2 got the road cars better than F1 have. That's by far. And even the supercars in Project Cars 2 weren't that great to drive. So yeah, I mean the cars themselves. I mean it's nice to have it as a feature because I say with the Prey apps in real life, it is a slight indication into an F1 driver is almost like promotion, the promotional side of F1. Obviously, the drivers aren't just paid to just drive at the end of the day. And that's what the majority of it is, but they're there to also effectively market the brand of the team all at the same time. But I think the big thing is they got F1 life wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems to surround furniture, lighting, having supercars in your living room. I think they've got the life very, very wrong. It could have been very, very good. I mean, I remember I was saying to you before we started, I remember on Sky Sports, obviously the presenters go and do some fun things with the drivers. For example, Kimi Räikkönen one year they effectively raced lawnmowers with him, and it was good fun to watch. I mean, if there was some silly stuff like that, a bit like almost like a media thing where you'd take out a supercar for a drive with someone next to you or something like that, I think that would have been better. But generally speaking, a lot of people aren't there for the F1 life. They're there for the racing, the F1.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of what you've said, Jordan. I think physics-wise, it feels numb. Is the word I was trying to look for before. When you're driving the cars, I feel like F1 life. And I'm gonna tell people a theory, and Jordan knows this theory, and a lot of people do. I feel like F1 life was supposed to be a bigger component of the game than what we've got now. I feel that because of the backlash that Codemasters and EA received when the supercars were announced, they kind of rolled back on that. And in the early phases of the game, before the patches came in, there's been a new patch today as well, you were getting supercar tokens even after you'd acquired all the tokens that you needed to unlock a supercar. So I feel like it was supposed to be a bigger component to the game, and because of the negative reaction, they pulled back on that, and I don't blame them at all for trying something different. I think, it's important to try something different with F1, trying to capture the sort of driver side. Jordan touched on it there. An F1 driver nowadays isn't paid just to drive a car. They've got to be in promotional adverts and stuff, and they could have gone a bit daft with it. I feel like they could have gone one of two ways, and instead they chose a really weird third option that nobody considered. The first way was to go and do something daft with it, do some lawnmower racing, do something silly. People wouldn't have minded that because that would have been very different. But the other way that they could have gone, which is what Codemasters have done before, and I feel like this is a licensing thing, is they could have used classic F1 cars which aren't in the game. They're not in the game at all in F1 22. And I find that decision creatively baffling, that unless it was a licensing issue, which I suspect would be the case, which is why they don't have the the Benetton B195 or the Ferrari F1 2004 or the Williams FW04 or anything like that. We don't have those cars in the game like we used to, and I think that's because of a licensing problem. Now, the only other thing that I am gonna mention about F1 Life, this is the last thing that we're gonna mention, is a rumour that, and I'm going to give a little bit of context here. The rumour behind F1 Life, whether this holds true or not is another matter. We'll only find out in the next 6 to 12 months. We know that EA also make other racing games. We know that their big series for racing games has always been Need for Speed. And there is a rumour floating about that F1 for the supercars has kind of been a little test mule for the supercars in terms of the handling physics to then be sort of moved on over to Need for Speed, the new one that is due to come out any time between now and the next 12 months. it's just something I'm going to throw out there for people who are listening and watching this back. You know, maybe in 6 to 12 months' time we'll see a handling model that's been based off something within the supercars. Whether this is true, it's only a rumour, so take this with a pinch of salt. But it's something to think about. Maybe there's been some differences there. Who knows? We'll find out eventually. Now, George, you've done a bit of career, you've done a bit of my team, and I've got some points I want to make about career mode and my team, and you know, even 2-player career mode. So we'll kind of cover it all in one batch, really. How have you found it? How's my team been? I know you haven't gone too much in depth with my team, but you've done a lot of single-player gameplay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in the my team, I've only done a round of my team, but I've also been doing obviously a bit of co-op play.
Excuse me.
And you can definitely. The nice thing with the my team is that it gives you an option of where you want to be, where you want to start. I think that's the biggest kind of positive for most players, because see, players like me and you, Jack, we will always put our team at the bottom and build it up.
Yeah.
To a champion winning car. But there's going to be other people who just want to get in a car that they get in a team that they own, but be really quick off the bat, and now they can do that. There was never an option before, so it does cater for players, and you can definitely tell the difference between for when upgrades come in. I mean, my car is obviously at the bottom of the stack. I say at the bottom, it's about third place, because they don't quite put you all the way at the bottom. But you can definitely tell with the FOM car that it's heavy, it doesn't really want to turn, and the aero is not quite there with a car that's got no development work on it. And you can definitely tell more so, I think, in this game than 21 when the upgrades come in. Because in 21 the car was, because the regulation and the way they were, you could feel the changes, but nowhere near to the extent of this season, I don't think. Obviously they've gotten rid of the interviews, which is to a degree quite nice, but in another degree a bit annoying, because again I still think the best interview system was from 2010.
Always has been.
Because I remember when you used to get on the podium, you had to go to the press conference. And that was quite nice, rather than almost every session. And you wouldn't get bugged every session either with some pointless questions. So to a degree it's quite nice, but to another degree it's a bit annoying, because it kind of takes a little bit of depth away from it to a degree. But I think the biggest change, really, other than the cards, in terms of the actual managing of the my team, is that there seems to be a lot more facility events.
Yeah.
Compared to the past, like you seem to do a lot more in terms of like the marketing events, especially because that's where you want to choose your rivals and effectively answer fan mail, which I guess is to a degree your press interviews.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that you've actually touched upon that I was going to talk about, was these, again, quality of life changes, where within my team there are quite a few little features that have been added in. You know, those extended events, the marketing events, powertrain departments, they've been retwigged and rebalanced. It's quite nice to see. It's a little bit more fresh compared to what it used to be like, and that's quite nice. Again, with, like Jordan said, I feel the interview system, ever since it left F1 2010 and wasn't around for a few years, hasn't been anywhere near as good as what they did in F1 2010, and why they haven't gone back to a sort of similar formula, I'm not really quite sure. I feel like that's still one of the best things that Codemasters ever introduced and then promptly took away, and interviews I don't think really feature now. I always felt that the interviews, when they did bring them back with Claire, who was doing the reporting, they felt quite tacked on. I never felt that they were as good as they should be, and I actually quite prefer answering as a fresh change more than anything. I prefer the answers being given through the fan mail and such, You know, because we see it on F1 at the moment. You know, there's always fans to reply to, requests. We've seen I think it was last weekend or the weekend before, Max Verstappen was meeting with a young boy, I think, who had some form of condition. I wasn't sure what it was, but you know, little things like that, which I feel like are important to improve the depth of a career mode. I'm doing driver career at the moment, which I've gone through. I'd love to say that Formula 2 is detailed, but unfortunately I feel like driver career in F2 this year is just sort of there. It's a thing that exists.
It's
But
the same as last year. I mean, at the end of the day, I think they're pretty much using F2 not really to its full extent.
No.
And it is literally just a thing to go, oh look, you've been in F2, now you get to drive in F1 sort of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas I think they could have had that a lot more detailed and potentially had the F3 on it as well.
I think I thought the same as you, Jord, but I know for a fact that the reason why F3 isn't really around at the moment, and whether it'll be for next year is another matter, and the reason why F2 hasn't seen some attention kind of comes back to what I was talking about before. The team Codemasters have been so focused on getting the F1 car regs up to date that they haven't had time to do anything with F2 and F3. I just think that for them, because the 12-month development cycle that they have with each game, the lead development cycle I should say, when they first start doing the game, I feel like what they're doing now is just trying to make sure that they get the cars in the right window, and then maybe next year they'll have a look at whether anything will change in F2, whether they'll introduce Formula 3, which is been quite a sticking point for quite some time. We don't know yet still when F3 is going to come to an F1 game. I wouldn't hold your breath for next year, unfortunately, from the murmurings that I'm hearing so far, but things change very quickly, and if they get them in, we'll have another feature. So let's hope it'll be better. But go on.
As I say, for me, for the my team aspect, obviously, I know you've got like F1 manager coming in, but what would be kind of nice for like my team is obviously you can sign drivers to your F1 squad. It would be good to almost have like an academy section whereby you sign possibly some of the lower end F2 drivers, or if F3 became some F3 drivers, and you can actually watch them during their progress during the season and potentially promote them up or let them go. I mean, that as an addition for me would be quite good and quite realistic.
Yeah, and the thing is that is already present in another motorsport game that is out this year, and that's MotoGP 22. It's been a feature for a couple of seasons now. The motorbike series developed by Milestone. You know, that is something that you can do. You can have a management team and have the riders develop themselves through the. So how in depth it is. I've only just purchased MotoGP 22, and I'm still getting a feel for it for the time being. So, and I will do a review on it for those that are interested. But that is something that I've always noticed that other game development companies outside of Codemasters tend to do. They have this ability to put things in place, whereas Codemasters don't. Now, I do think part of that comes down to licensing. I do think FOM are very strict with their licensing. That's why the damage model from F1 2021 was changed, and that's why the damage model in 22 is not as broad as what it should be, because it's a licensing issue in terms of sponsorship, so they can't have bits and pieces of bodywork flying over because, again, licensing, like I said. But yeah, I think moving away from that, the only other thing that I briefly want to mention before, Jordan, I'll let you have a little bit to talk about any other things that you do quite like or dislike about the game, is the addition of Mark Priestley as your race engineer. Gone is Jeff since, when was he implemented? Oh God, I've got to say 2011 I think it was. But however long Jeff has been the race engineer in F1 he's no longer there. We've got Mark Priestley now. He used to be a Formula 1 engineer on the pit wall himself. I like it. It's a nice change. He says the similar lines to Jeff, but it just feels a little bit more immersive. He's recorded it on official F1 headsets that they actually use on the pit wall. So that feels a little bit more immersive than it's ever done before. I think it's a good addition. It's nice to change. All for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to have a different voice in your ear. But I mean, there's no real escaping that it's a similar thing.
No, it's not.
Don't get me wrong, it's nice to have an actual ex-engineer doing it in this process to see that happening, but I mean, for me, ultimately, it's just a voice in your ear that you get frustrated with when it doesn't tell you the right strategy.
I feel like that's more of a game issue than it is with a mark issue. I think that's the thing.
But I think you can't understand where I'm coming from. It's a different voice, but ultimately, in the actual view of the game itself, it's just the same thing, just with a slightly nicer voice to come out. It's just makes us better every time.
Especially when you crashed out, because it felt quite soulless. Yeah, it felt quite soulless. A couple of things that I want to mention before we move on, which one thing that I forgot to mention, which is actually a really big update, but people would see it as a change. I think Jordan would agree it's probably more of a change than anything. Is the ability to change commentator. You no longer have to listen to David Croft and Anthony Davidson if you don't want to. You can now have Alex Jakes, who presents the Channel 4 Formula 1 coverage, as well as the W Series, which he commentates on, and a number of other series. And I believe Natalie Pinkham, I want to say, who joins in with that. So it's a bit of diversity included within Formula 1 in terms of having a female co-commentator, which is quite a nice addition. I immediately switched over to Alex Jakes because that was the logical decision to do after spending so much time with David Croft's commentary. It's refreshing, it's new, it's a change. Again, I can't disagree with the change to that. Jordan, I don't know if you've made that swap at all, or...
Yeah, I found Alex Jakes, though I have noticed that you do get a mixture of Pinkham and Davidson, regardless which one.
Oh really? I did not know that.
Yeah. So sometimes Anthony Davidson, sometimes it's... yeah, I mean, again, in a similar way to the engine, it's nice to have that option, because I don't really fancy listening to Crofty, and I hear him enough watching F1 on Sky Sports. Again, it's a nice thing to have, but again, it's the opening scenes, the ending scenes, and how many times do you really listen to it? Probably not. So again, it's one of those nice changes to have because it's something different, but in the retrospect of the game, I don't think it's much odds to a degree.
No, it's absolutely understandable. I get what you go. So before we move on to multiplayer, Jordan, have you got anything in terms of you want to throw in? You want to talk about the game? Any positives, negatives? What you thinking?
I think in terms of positive and negative, we've kind of covered most things in terms of the biggest thing for me is actually one of the rules I disagree with, which is less of a game problem, but more of an actual F1 thing. And you'll know about this, Jack. Obviously, the tyre selection at the start of the Grand Prix.
You can't argue about the official rules.
I know, you can't argue with the official rules, but that now, obviously, with the top 10 not having to start on their Q2 tyres that they qualify through on, I mean, it does, and as we say, it's an official rule rather than an actual game thing, but for me, it does impact the gameplay, because it takes away that potential strategy, especially if you qualify outside the top 10. I mean, I remember in multiple league races I've done where I've managed to qualify into the top 10 on mediums to have that advantage, or I've gone an alternative strategy because I'm outside the top 10 and it will work, and now everyone just gets a fresh set of tyres, and it takes that sort of element away from it. But on the same front, that not necessarily fully gets balanced, but it does get a slight balance when you exit the pits on completely cold tyres, and that's where you find out if you can drive or not. Is can you drive on cold tyres and get them warmed up? Which I think is a really good thing to have. So
Yeah.
Tyre warm up on the exit of the pits. Because I think there's been too many games where you can just drive up the pits and immediately go fast. And it's really not the case.
Yeah, I think that's I touched on it earlier as well to say that is a really good feature. I think there's issues with that in terms of single player career mode, because the AI get up to speed very quickly compared to yourself. So if you're on a track that potentially doesn't have fast flowing corners that are slow ones, so I'm looking at maybe Monaco as an example, you're going to be a lot slower unless you warm the tyres up, and the AI is still a little bit too quick in terms of getting their temperatures up to speed compared to yourself. So that's something that Codemasters hopefully will be looking at in future patches. Maybe they've updated it in today's patch. 1.08 is out today, as I mentioned before, so that could have changed. Who knows? But let's move on to the multiplayer, because that's a big part of next gen, of course, in terms of league racing, in terms of online play. Now, I'm not going to talk about public lobbies because they're full of 5 to 10-year-olds who don't know how to drive and just crash into you. That's part and parcel of a lot of racing games, annoyingly. But what I do want to talk about with multiplayer is the issues. Because I feel like that every year when a Formula 1 game comes out by Codemasters, they don't really know why the lobbies are so glitchy when the game first released. Now, they are a bit better. We are 6 weeks pretty much now after release date, so you're going to be expecting them to be a lot better. But it's taken a bit of time. I have to say, it's taken a bit of time to sort them out, and maybe the patch today has stabilised that a little bit further. But there are still latency issues, there's still lagging issues, there's still blue screens as far as I'm aware, which is a bit of an unfortunate one. But my biggest worry isn't actually, technically speaking, a feature yet. Jordan, have you done the crossplay trials yet?
I didn't take part in them.
Didn't take part.
Once didn't get a chance, but I have heard about others' experiences on the crossplay.
How were others' experiences?
Positive.
Positive, which is a good thing.
Yeah. Obviously, the downside to a degree with the crossplay is that there's a big focus on RaceNet,
which
your EA account, because you can't. We're on a PlayStation, for example. We can't just go into our friends list on our PlayStation. Go invite this person, please.
Yeah.
You do actually have to go onto RaceNet, be friends with that player, so that you can then invite them into the lobby. But it's a small price to pay to have fuller grids online, and I think that's ultimately the big aim, isn't it, in league racing, is can you get full grids consistently? And I think this will open that up, not only to have fuller grids, but to have more divisions and multiple full grids for the same day of racing. But yeah, overall, I've heard positive things, and the fact that it does work. There has been a couple of negative things in which players not necessarily aren't allowed to join midway through a session.
Yeah.
But it does. I have heard issues where it has caused the lobby issues if a player does join midway through, say, a practice session or a quali session. It has created issues within the lobby for that. So. Possibly something that will come out in a later patch to try and fix that. But as a general rule, it basically means that everyone who's racing gets in before it kicks off. But again, it's all a lot of the negative stuff I've heard is all very minor things that can be fixed with a simple rule and potentially patched in as they continue to test it and develop it.
Yeah, there's still quite a lot to do with that, and what I will say is that it's a positive that we will be able to cross play with other members. Admittedly, the one thing that my two biggest worries come from, number one, RaceNet has never been a stable platform. No matter what game they've implemented it into, I've always found RaceNet to just break. But I do think that the way that they're using it in this F1 game is actually quite light. They're just making sure that you're using the profile so you can get people invited in. So hopefully that won't have a big impact. But the second point, and I did say before that I am worried about this, is when it comes to league racing, because I was having a good chat with somebody I know who's a PC player and an F1 player, and I was having a good skate around through a good number of F1 forums that have got a lot of experience between them, and that there's different force feedback between PC and PlayStation. Now, whether this is the same thing on Xbox, I'm not 100% confident on, but I do know for certain that there is different feedback between PC and PlayStation. Now, for those that League Race will automatically know what I'm going to say next, but for those that don't, just listen up. If you've got two different sets of feedback going on, that means there's going to be two completely different ways of driving going on between the PC players and the PlayStation players, which I'm going to use the example of within the game. So at some tracks, you guarantee that the PC or PlayStation players are going to be a lot faster than the counterpart, and that could throw up some big issues. I know that the setups are slightly different between PC and F1, but between PC and PlayStation, which won't actually make too much of a difference. It's only a difference between tyre pressures and a little bit to do with wings. That's not really the main problem. But the force feedback, two different ways of driving, I'm a little bit worried about that. Hopefully that will get sorted. Apparently there are people who are looking into it within Codemasters, so we can still have faith. But that's just something I wanted to mention, because I feel like if there's two different levels of feedback and they are slightly different, even if they're slightly different, it's going to cause big problems further down the line for league racing. Judd, thoughts on that? What do you reckon?
I think that the problem is, I think it's going to be the same PC to console regardless, even if they do little patches to make it slightly more even. There's always going to be that additional bit of feedback or additional bit of sensitivity play, because obviously on a PC you can
make of course,
even further finite adjustments. However, I think from what I've heard from the trials, actually the PC guys are actually on a pace with the console, and the console's on a pace with the PC. So I think the actual pace difference is not as big as people are thinking. Obviously, it depends what sort of pace you're at anyway. Because obviously, if you're if you tend to race against 85 AI and the guy you're racing races on 1995, it doesn't matter what he's on, he's going to be quicker than you.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes people don't quite take that into consideration. They just go, "Oh, he's on a PC, so he's faster." It could well be that it goes to a console and it can be just as fast anyway. So I think you've got to take that sort of thing with a pinch of salt, because no one really knows, unless you're part of a league like us, no one really knows what difficulties people play at, what sort of pace they do have generally. So in that respect, it's kind of hard to really tell, but from what I've heard, it's been fairly, between people on similar pace, it's been fairly even fights, with sometimes a console person winning out over the PC player. So,
well, I mean, I haven't taken part in the trials, unfortunately. I know you haven't either, Joel, but I do hope that doesn't become an issue when we get to a point where this is. And what I mean by the worry is that we come maybe 2 months down the line from where we are today, and we find that people who are normally of a similar pace between the consoles and the PC, and you find that there's a little bit of a gap. Now, if they iron that out, fantastic. If it's not a problem in the first place, even better. But it's just something that I heard, and I feel like it's, again, important to raise. The only other thing that I wanted to raise that had been notable was the straight line speed of the AI. Now, again, today the patch has come out 1.08, so, and one of the patch notes says that it's redressed the balance. Now, I've no idea if it's readdressed the balance. I haven't had time. I've only done one race at Imola, and it does feel like the AI are a little bit more reachable down the straights, but I've only done one race, so I can't give you a conclusive answer. A lot of people are saying that it's worked, which is good news. Reading the forums, people have done quite a bit of testing. They're finding that the AI have been curbed a little bit. Some are saying by quite a lot, some are saying by a little bit, but either way, it's making it a lot more manageable now to race AI in a straight line rather than being blasted down the straight compared to normal. So, in terms of everything we've come round to so far, you know, the other thing to mention for those that are on PC who are listening to this, the addition of VR into F1 for the first time has been implemented. You know, it's something for people to, you know, people have been crying out for F1 games to have VR, and now that wish has been, you know, supplanted, and by all accounts seems to be relatively alright. It's been a bit glitchy, which is to be expected when it's been implemented for the first time. That's not to say it's an excuse, but that's just to, you know, curb any expectations. But that's a good thing to have, you know, for the PC players anyway.
Yeah, I think generally, I mean, we've been on about crossplay, especially for the last 4 years. You know, when is it going to come? And it was always a case of whether the biggest thing wasn't necessarily the PC side. It was always about Microsoft and Sony, wasn't it? Really, because
yeah,
obviously the PC side was Microsoft anyway, with operating systems for the majority of gaming PCs. So that was Xbox to PC. I think was always going to happen, but as whether Sony were going to allow it on PlayStation as well, which is good to see that it is going to happen. Because I said, I mean, fuller grids are better races in my opinion, and it's one of the best ways forward to get that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think in terms of our, you know, discussion and review, we're sort of coming towards the sort of tail end of that now. And, you know, really it's just sort of almost like the closing comments, if you wanna say that much about it. But before we do, I do want to make a mention about the sort of the importance of F1 and the importance that racing games are going to have over the next 18 months. And what I'll also do is, there's two questions I'm going to ask Jordan just to have a think about, and then I'll let him have a think about it whilst I make my other points. The first one, Jordan, is, would you recommend this game to somebody who bought F1 21 or hasn't bought an F1 game, technically speaking? And the second question is, in terms of a score out of 10, what would you give it? So have a little think, because what I wanted to discuss, and again coming back to it, 18 months, next 18 months is kind of I'd say a big time for releases in the racing game world, because we are, you know, we've just seen in the last few months the release of Gran Turismo 7, which I am hoping to do a review on, if Jordan is up for it. I think it's important to get a review out for Gran Turismo 7 because it's been out for a few months, and that was quite a mixed release. If you've not played Gran Turismo 7 or even heard much about it, I'd certainly go and have a look and see what the noise coming out of Polyphony is right now, the developers of course. But coming forward, we've got this sort of end of an era. We've got the last WRC game that's going to be developed by, I believe, Killerton. That's going to be their last game, and then Codemasters are taking over the WRC license following the conclusion of the 2022 season, so we might get a first Codemasters Rally WRC game next year. Now, as a result of the license, Dirt Rally 3 we don't believe is going to be coming out now. That's been mothballed, which is unfortunate. Forza Motorsport, the return, of, you know, arguably one of the most influential racing game series of all time. That's going to have a brand new update and reboot. That's coming out in 2023. We've got a return, rather, of a classic game. Test Drive is coming back in terms of Test Drive Unlimited. That's being developed by Milestone. They're giving a one-to-one recreation of Hong Kong, which is a fascinating, amazing place for a video game to be set. But they're going to do a one-to-one street recreation of that. So how that's going to go, it's a very ambitious game. Hopefully that works for them. We also know there are a few other games that are coming out that are quite big in terms of what's going to be coming out from. We know that Assetto Corsa 2 is coming out sometime, allegedly 2024, which is, you know, 18 months away from now, less than that. And there are a few others releases that are going to be dotted about, and this is the perfect time, I feel, for a developer. One other game that I was on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't remember it. We know that Motorsport Games are developing the next British touring car game. No idea how that's going to play out, because their most recent release, which was NASCAR Ignition, I want to say, met with quite a negative response. But those that are in charge of Motorsport Games know how important it is to get a good BTCC game because of how loved Toka is. But this is the perfect opportunity for a developer to come in and release a good game. A sort of game developer by the size, sort of like the size of what Kunos were, who've made the Assetto Corsa games, or what Slightly Mad Studios were when they developed Project Cars. It's the ample opportunity for another racing series to slot in quite nicely and not have to worry too much about the big releases, because they're quite far away from today's date, which is, you know, currently the 9th of August. Unless I've time travelled, I think it is the 9th of August. It is. So F1 now has quite a nice period of time to settle in, get some updates in, and be the sort of focal game that arguably Gran Turismo 7 should have been, but it didn't play out that way. So F1's going to get quite a lot more players coming in over the next 6 months, obviously with the Christmas holidays and the January sales coming in. I feel like this is the best time for Codemasters to really develop the game as best as they can, get it to a certain point, and then nail the game in F1 23, which is no doubt what it's going to be called, because the competition is going to be Forza, which is a different game entirely, and that's going to come out allegedly early 2023. And the other big releases are going to be later on in the year, sort of October time. F1's going to have this nice little gap of maybe 5 months where everyone's going to be really interested in it. And if Codemasters and EA can make a good game, maybe even put F3 in it, I'd be surprised if they did, but who knows. If they do that, that's going to be one hell of a window for them, and for whatever little developer that might be out there. I say little compared to AAA games. They're going to have a good chance to get themselves on the market. Jordan, I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I mean, I know I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent, but it is important to mention context when it comes to, you know, video game, racing game releases, because there aren't any big ones apart from obviously Need for Speed, but we don't really know when the release date of Need for Speed's going to be. It could be 6 months from now, it could be in 3 months. Nobody's got a clue.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, obviously the British Touring Car game, which is on hold at the moment, is probably one of the biggest disappointments of this year, I think, for motorsport games. Very much arguably one of the most disappointing ones, because I think that one especially, I think, with what was coming out this year, I think that game in particular was the most looked forward to of the year, I think. It'd be fair to say. And then it was like you liked sort of your MotoGP or F1, obviously WRC. I mean, it depends what style of rally you want, because obviously Codemasters have a very different style compared to Codemasters. But yeah, I mean, in the context of things, F1's come out at about the right time. It's months after GT7. it's not really clashing with that. It's not really clashed with anything, not really, and it's got this lovely few months of peace and quiet that it can just be its own on its own, and it's the freshest game for the next 3 months. But I think for returning players, it's worth buying because it's a brand new challenge, and I think for new players as well, it's also a nice game. I mean, it's probably harder to get into as a fresh player because of the way the physics are. They are that little bit more loose, a little bit more like the regulations we have this year. So I think it's harder to get into, but I think once you get into it, the satisfaction of making a car like that go around circuits and as fast as they do is always worth it. And if you exclude the F1 life completely and just play it for what it should be, which is an F1 game, in terms of the racing, the online, especially for leagues, if you play it for that and you pretty much forget about the F1 life, it's a great game, in my opinion. Obviously being updated and with little fixes here and there to make sure it runs as smooth as possible, but that's the same as any game now. There's no such thing as a complete game on release anymore.
Now, morally, you're already clashing with me by bringing that up. I am of the belief that if you're gonna, I mean, I'm one of those people. For those that don't know me that well, I'm one of those people who believes that if you're gonna deliver a game and sell a game, it should be complete. I don't like a lot of post patches. I can appreciate there's going to be glitches in games, but I don't like it when there's fundamental features that are broken and then implemented into the game and then released half baked. I've never been a big fan of that. Actually, that is a very good point. I've just realised, and coming back to it, Jord, I mentioned earlier you bought the F1 Champions Edition. How much did you pay for that? Just remind us.
I think in the end I paid £71.
£71. I know you've had a bit of discount with that, yeah. Has it been worth it, having 3 days early access, my pit coins, of course, and the icons where you can get quite a good number of drivers?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, there's only one icon I ever pick anyway, but
obviously,
I mean, for me, it wasn't necessarily about the pit coin or the early access or the icons. For me, and obviously you know this, Jack, obviously the Champions Edition for the PlayStation is the only one, and it'd be the same for Xbox. The Champions Edition is the only one that has both PS4 and PS5 copies included, which means that if I do get a PS5 and make the switch over within the next year before the next game comes out, I don't have to spend another 60 quid on the PS5 version, which for an extra, was it 12 quid? Because I think, what did you pay for yours? Probably 55, 60 quid?
47.
Yeah, you probably got it from somewhere else.
I did get it from somewhere else, but normally it would retail about 50, yeah.
About 50 quid. So for the sake of basically 20 quid, to have effectively £120 worth of versions of games, I think it's not a bad idea. But obviously, if you are on the PS5 version, it's up to you whether you want to pay the extra money for the extra content, like the Miami pack, the icons, the Bitcoin. It's whether you want that or not. Otherwise, you can just get the standard PS5 version, and the gameplay's not really any different.
What would you score it, Jord, out of 10?
Now the problem is because of the F1 line, I'd like to give it quite like a 9, 10, because the way the gameplay is really nice. Everything's a bit more challenging, but because they put in the F1 life, it's probably more like a 7.5 for me. And unfortunately, I'd like to rate it without the F1 life, but unfortunately, it's part of the game, so it has to be included.
Yeah, and I made it clear up at the top, you know, that although I'm giving a lot of context about the review that we're doing, it's also really important to make sure that people understand that we are reviewing the game. You know, we're not reviewing the context, and we can't avoid, you know, certain features of the game if they're thrust upon you. I mean, if you're watching my screen at the moment, you can see if I go straight onto the main menu, there it is. You can see F1 Life is its own determined thing. That's actually the most important thing after home screen in terms of sorting it out. Now, whether I'd recommend it to returning players, absolutely. I feel like that F1 22 is a new challenge, like Jordan said. It's really positive. I definitely think it's worth it. If you haven't played F1 for quite some time, or you're looking to step into it, I'd also definitely recommend it, because there's a lot going on in the game that you can enjoy. Absolutely, I think that's something you can. There's so many things that you can explore. Go and drive the F2 cars, because they are quite fun to drive. They are a little bit more challenging, from time to time, and at certain tracks. And I do enjoy them, and the sound, of course, is a nice little V8 that you can still enjoy the revs rising and wish you were still back in 2009. But hey ho, that's a long time ago now, 2009. But in terms of a score to give it, and I've been mulling on this. I was mulling on this before we started the podcast. I had a number set in mind, and I've been varying that number by half a point or not. And then I thought it's actually pointless in putting half a point in, because I feel like that's going for a middle ground that I can't really give it. I'd score it a 7 out of 10. I'd score it higher, just like Jordan said, but the problem is that F1 Life takes up so much unnecessary. It's just the whole mode, unfortunately, for me personally, is unnecessary. I don't care about items such as, let's go to the item shop, let's just have a quick look. I don't care about a sofa. I don't care about wall art. I don't care about lamps. I've never been interested in that sort of thing. Wearing apparel and stuff like clothing, I kind of get that. That's okay. I don't mind that too much. But I don't feel a need to spend my hard-earned pit coins on a lampshade at level 24 normal, or a stupid dance that you can do on the podium, or a pose, or the colour of my floor. It's an F1 game. I don't feel like that part of it should be included.
See, I agree with you on some of that. I agree with obviously the sofas, and I don't want to get to level 30 and find out I want a lampshade.
Yeah.
But in terms of like the poses and the podium celebrations, I don't mind that too much, because especially the podium celebrations, because okay, some of them are wacky and they're a bit unrealistic. But
it's the wacky ones I don't like. That's my issue.
But to a degree, it kind of gives the game more character than it would have done without it, rather than just like on Championship Edition when you used to go to it was just quick wave, and that was it. Like at least with this, people have some way of still have a way of being their own character.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That is fair. I think that's a really good point, actually. I'm just grumpy. That's it. I don't like the wacky ones. I don't mind having a different variant in it, but I don't really like the one thing that I think sometimes the wackiness of it goes a bit too far. It's like your podium mode could be peanut butter jelly. What on earth is no F1 driver in history is going to be shouting that when they cross the line in first, singing peanut butter jelly time? It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So I just
sounds like something you might do.
I wouldn't say that. I'd break down crying. That's what I'd do. I'd get that a bit more.
Listen up, Codemasters. Get a sob story one ready.
Get a sob story, yeah. I feel, but my thing, the only thing to round off about, and just to explain my 7 out of 10 a little bit more, is that the game, I feel, is a continued step forward that Codemasters has done each year since 2015. I don't think there's been a step backward from any of the games, and when I say that, I don't just mean gameplay. I mean everything in general. I just feel like F1 Life was such a botched opportunity that what the sort of in-between state that it's in right now, it's not anything really. It's just sort of mindless addition that didn't need to be there. And I still think there's a few glitches, like the audio glitch, that's still a problem, and a couple of issues with online that still need to be patched out and worked on for me. But overall, as I've already said, I definitely recommend it for anybody who wants to buy it, who's interested in it, on the fence. Get it, you'll enjoy it, I guarantee. If you like wacky podium celebrations and not a miserable git like me, then get wacky celebrations. You know, you do that. But I feel a 7 out of 10 is a good score, and it would have been a lot higher had F1 Life not even been there. I'll be brutally honest with you. If F1 Life wasn't even a feature, I'd have probably scored it a 9. But such is life. Such is life. You know, hopefully EA and Codemasters will take it on board, and that, you know, the feedback from the communities and the respective leagues, which they are always listening to, which is really important to do. And hopefully next year's game, F1 23, will have a couple of features in there that I think people will want to have, like, you know, potentially F3. It's an idea. Jordan, have you got anything to add before we close?
No, I don't think so.
Well, that's our review of F1 22. A nice average of 7.25 out of 10, really, which is a good score to have, to be honest. We will be looking at potentially doing some more reviews and doing some more special editions of the Next Gen podcast. I also can't go this whole review without mentioning our F1 22 League within Next Gen that will be starting on Tuesday nights. That will begin on the 28th of August. So that's only 3 weeks away from now. It will be cross-play. It will be PlayStation to begin with, of course, PS4, PS5. Once cross-play opens up and we know that the lobbies are generally fine and stable, we'll open it up to PC. So that'll happen before the end of this season. So I'm looking forward to that, and do make sure, if you haven't done so already, check out Next Gen on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course on Discord as well. Loads of different platforms that you can have a look at, and any information you do need to know. And if you're interested in any other potential Next Gen leagues, we do have them on PC with iRacing, and we do have them on console once Gran Turismo 7 sorts itself out, and any other potential games that we're still looking into. Cough Wreckfest. But thank you very much, Jordan, for joining us this evening.
No worries, it's been a pleasure.
A pleasure as always, and thank you for watching and taking the time out of your day, evening or afternoon, whenever it might be, to watch this review. But we've been Next Gen. Thanks very much for watching, and see you in the next podcast that'll be coming, hopefully, pretty soon.